Okay, so today we're uh, really diving into the core of something that everyone's talking about, but not everybody understands,
Yeah,
and that's digital security.
it really is everywhere.
It is everywhere, and there's a lot of information out there. And so for this deep dive, we really went through a lot of material and tried to sort of pull out the core
Yeah.
concepts, the core practices, the core threats, and tools that everyone should really have a good understanding of.
Yeah, I think that was the goal, right? Not to just give people a bunch of terms to memorize, but to actually get them to understand
Right.
what it is.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like, why should I care about this?
Mm-hmm.
So, we're going to try to give you that shortcut to understanding all of these complex ideas in a way that makes sense without getting bogged down in all the jargon.
Right.
So, we'll start with the basics. One of the most fundamental concepts in security is known as the CIA triad.
Oh, I love this one.
Yeah. So, think of these as like the three pillars of information security.
Mm-hmm.
You've got confidentiality. So, that's about protecting your data from prying eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have integrity.
Yeah.
That's about making sure that your data is accurate and hasn't been tampered with in any way.
Right. Unchanged.
Unchanged, exactly.
Yeah.
And then availability, this is ensuring that you can actually access your systems and data
Right.
whenever you need them. So if you think about like,
Oh, so important, right?
so important, yeah. If we talk about confidentiality, this is where things like encryption, strong privacy policies, these all sort of come into play.
Right. Yeah, and like if that fails, you're looking at data breaches and all kinds of nasty stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Nobody wants that. Okay, so then you've got integrity, like I said, making sure that data hasn't been messed with. And, we can talk about blockchain as like a prime example here. Blockchain with its tamper-proof record. Any changes, you're going to know about it. Or even simple checksums or cryptographic hashes can also detect unwanted changes.
Yeah. Those can catch things that you would never notice otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you've got availability. So this is all about resilience, right? Redundant systems. So you've got backups upon backups. You've got things like protection against denial of service attacks. These are designed to overwhelm a system and make it unavailable.
Right. Those can really cripple a business if they
Absolutely.
can't serve their customers.
Yeah, so it's interesting because the priority of these three can really shift depending on what you're trying to protect and who you are.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Like if you think about the military, right? Confidentiality might be like the #1 priority. They're dealing with like top secret information.
Yeah, I can't have that getting out.
Exactly. But if you think about an e-commerce site, they probably care a lot more about availability. They need to make sure that site is up and running so people can buy things, right?
Makes sense. That's their bread and butter.
Exactly. Or healthcare providers. They're going to be hugely focused on confidentiality because they're dealing with patient health information.
Right. Incredibly sensitive data.
Yeah, highly sensitive. Whereas if you think about a manufacturing plant, they might be much more concerned about integrity, making sure the production data is accurate and hasn't been tampered with so that nothing goes wrong in the production line.
Yeah, that could have huge safety implications.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then, of course, customer service. Once again, availability is usually king, right?
Yeah. People need to be able to reach them.
They need to be able to get support.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how those three sort of play with each other, and knowing the context really helps you decide how to prioritize your security efforts. Right.
Absolutely. Context is everything.
Exactly. So, okay, let's move on to some other key principles here. There's this idea of like less is more when it comes to security.
Okay. I'm intrigued.
So one concept is this thing called least functionality. This basically means like keeping your systems as stripped down as possible, only having the essential features and services running.
Like minimizing what you have exposed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A good example would be like a web server. It should really only be running those services that are absolutely necessary to host the website. That way there are fewer potential weaknesses for an attacker to exploit.
Right. Like closing all the unnecessary doors and windows.
Exactly, yeah. Fewer features means fewer potential vulnerabilities. Then there's this concept of least privilege.
Okay.
This is all about making sure that users only have the access they need to do their jobs and nothing more. So, like a data entry clerk shouldn't have administrative control over the entire database.
Right. Contain the potential damage.
Exactly, yeah. If their account is compromised, the damage is much more limited. And then finally, there's need to know. This basically means restricting access to sensitive information only to those individuals who absolutely require to do their jobs. It's kind of common sense, right?
Yeah, like not sharing confidential information unless it's absolutely necessary.
Exactly, exactly. So you wouldn't CC everyone in the company on an email that has sensitive financial data or something like that.
Right, need to know basis.
Exactly. Okay, so now we have this idea of less is more, but then we've also got kind of this counterpoint, this idea of more is better.
Okay, so more is better. How does that work in security?
So a good example of this would be something called defense in depth.
Okay.
This is also sometimes referred to as layered defense, and it's this idea of having multiple layers of security controls in place. So you're not just relying on one thing to protect you. It's like, okay, you've got physical security at your office building, then you've got your network firewalls, then you've got antivirus software on your computer, and then you have like user training and awareness.
Wow, so it's like an onion, you peel back the layers.
Exactly like an onion.
Never.
And the idea is that if one layer fails, you've still got other layers there to back you up. So even if the attacker gets past your firewall, they've still got to get past your antivirus and hopefully your well-trained employees.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah.
It makes their job a lot harder, right?
Mm-hmm.
So another example of more is better would be separation of duties.
Mm-hmm.
This means dividing up critical tasks or responsibilities so that no single person has too much power.
Okay, like checks and balances?
Exactly, checks and
Okay.
balances, yeah.
Yeah.
So for example, in finance, the person who approves a payment shouldn't also be the one who initiates it. Or the person who reconciles the bank statement shouldn't be the one who makes the deposits, that kind of thing.
That helps prevent fraud or errors.
Exactly, because if one person's doing it all, it's really easy for things to slip through the cracks. And this even applies to smaller organizations. Even if you don't have a huge team, you can still implement compensating controls, like having the manager regularly review things.
That's a good point. You can always find ways to apply the principle.
Exactly. Okay, so now let's talk about how we group things in security, right?
Okay, grouping. I like it.
Yeah, so for data, we have this thing called data classification. This basically means categorizing your information based on how sensitive it is. So you might have data that's public, data that's internal, and data that's highly confidential.
Right, different levels of protection for different data.
Exactly, and a lot of financial institutions use tiered controls based on these classifications. So the more sensitive the data, the stricter the security controls.
That makes sense, yeah.
Then when we're talking about people, we have this thing called role-based access control, or RBAC. And this is where you grant people access to systems and data based on their role in the organization. So think about like a university, right?
Mm-hmm.
They might have different access levels for faculty, students, and staff.
Right, different roles need access to different things.
Exactly. Data classification is all about making sure that you're applying the right level of protection to the right information, and RBAC just makes it way easier to manage user permissions.
Yeah, keeps it consistent and organized.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, so we also see this grouping when we're talking about computers. Network segmentation is all about dividing your network into smaller, more manageable segments. And this actually helps with security and performance.
Okay, divide and conquer.
Yeah, divide and conquer, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's this thing called VLANs, or virtual LANs, and these allow you to logically group devices together, even if they're not physically in the same location. So you might, for example, keep your finance department on a separate VLAN from your marketing department.
So it's like creating virtual fences within the network.
Exactly, virtual fences. And then there's the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, and this acts as a buffer between your internal network and the public internet.
That sounds important.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is where you typically put your public-facing servers, like your web server, your email server, things like that.
So it's like a security checkpoint before entering the main network.
Exactly. So network segmentation, it helps contain breaches. If one segment is compromised, it's much harder for an attacker to move laterally to other parts of the network.
Right, it limits the blast radius.
Exactly. And the DMZ adds an extra layer of protection for those public-facing services, because they're the ones that are most exposed to attack.
Like having a moat around the castle.
I like that, the moat around the castle. Okay, so now let's talk about risk, because every organization has a certain level of risk they're willing to tolerate.
Right.
Right, you can't eliminate all risks.
Exactly.
Mhm.
It's always this balancing act between security and actually getting things done.
Yeah, you can't be so secure that you can't function.
Yeah, exactly. And so thinking about how much risk you're willing to accept also depends on who's trying to attack you, right? Like a small-time hacker versus like a nation state with sophisticated tools.
Right, the threat landscape is vast.
It's huge, yeah.
Yeah.
So really understanding your organization's risk tolerance and the potential impact of different types of threat actors, that's absolutely fundamental to making informed security decisions.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that brings us to baselines, which are essentially like your standard security configurations for all of your systems, right?
Okay, so like a security blueprint.
Yeah, like a security blueprint. And by monitoring for any deviations from these baselines, you can often detect potential vulnerabilities or even attacks that are already underway. So let's say a server suddenly has new software installed that shouldn't be there, or maybe a user account starts behaving strangely.
Right, red flags.
Exactly. Huge red flags. Baselines give you that point of reference to identify what normal looks like so you can spot those anomalies.
Yeah, it's all about knowing your environment.
Exactly. Okay, so finally, let's touch on the bigger picture here, like the overall landscape of security processes, tools, and techniques.
The security toolkit.
Yeah, the toolkit, exactly. So this includes things like having strong security policies that everyone in the organization actually understands and follows. It's super important that these policies have buy-in from the top, from leadership.
Yeah, security needs to be a top-down priority.
Absolutely. And then you've got things like having a well-defined incident response plan so that if something bad does happen, you know exactly what to do. You're not just scrambling around trying to figure it out.
Right, a plan of action.
Exactly. And then, of course, we've got all the tools. So you've got antivirus software, which has gotten really sophisticated in recent years. It's not just about signature-based detection anymore. You've got heuristic analysis, behavioral detection, all sorts of fancy stuff.
Those are constantly evolving to stay ahead of the threats.
Absolutely. And then we've got IAAA, that stands for Identification, Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting. So identification is about figuring out who you're dealing with. Authentication is about verifying their identity. And this is where multi-factor authentication, or MFA, is so important because it's not just about something you know like a password. It's also about something you have, like your phone, or something you are, like your fingerprint.
Right, multiple layers of verification.
Exactly. Then authorization is about determining what they're allowed to access. And accounting is all about keeping track of who did what and when. It's all about accountability.
So it's not just about keeping the bad guys out, it's about knowing what's going on inside, too.
Exactly, yeah. And then we've got firewalls, which are like the gatekeepers of your network. They control what traffic is allowed in and out. And then you've got intrusion detection and prevention systems, or IDSPS. These are designed to spot and block malicious activity. And then we have SIEM systems, which collect and analyze all those security logs from your various systems. And then NAA, which is network access control. So that's about controlling who and what is allowed to connect to your network in the first place. And then, of course, we've got cryptography.
The art of secret messages?
Exactly, the art of secret messages. This is all about using encryption and other techniques to secure your communications and data.
Right, making sure the data is unreadable to anyone who shouldn't see it.
Exactly. And then, you have frameworks like Amidary 18 and CK, which help us understand the tactics and techniques that attackers commonly use. And it sort of breaks down the entire attack lifecycle from initial reconnaissance all the way through to actually achieving their objective.
That sounds like a valuable resource.
It's a really helpful framework for understanding the threat landscape. And then, understanding common security risks, things like social engineering, malware, ransomware, insider threats, weak authentication, unpatched vulnerabilities, denial of service attacks. All these things are critical for building an effective defense.
Right, knowledge is power.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So to sort of sum everything up here, we've talked about the CIA triad, that idea of less is more and more is better when it comes to security principles, the importance of understanding risk and maintaining strong baselines, and all these different processes and tools that help keep us secure in this digital world.
It's a lot to take in, but it's all interconnected.
It really is. Yes, security is not just a one-time fix. It's an ongoing process of adaptation and vigilance.
Absolutely, you have to stay ahead of the curve.
Absolutely. So here's something to think about. In a world where these cyber threats are evolving all the time, and they're coming from all angles, what's one fundamental security habit that, if everybody adopted it, would make life so much harder for the attackers out there? Think about it.
Until next time.
Yeah, that's a good one to ponder.
See you next time.
See you later.